Hello, and thank you for joining me. I'm calling this lesson Following the Logic of Scripture, How the Bible Teaches Beyond Explicit Statements. I begin this way. The Bible is a book of order and reason. The Bible is a harmonious whole, inspired by a single divine author. There is continuity between the Old and the New Testaments. God does not change. He stated as much, Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6, I am the Lord, I do not change. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. No teaching of the Bible will conflict with another teaching. Any premise that violates a plain teaching of Scripture is an invalid premise. Not everything the Bible teaches is explicitly spelled out for us. Scripture teaches in principles and concepts that are never violated. We arrive at certain conclusions by logical deduction based upon what is written. One can be wise above what is written, so I wanted to just be careful to point that out. One can be wise above what is written, and there are those who will neglect the obvious for the obscure, and there's not a lot of profit in that. One can read things into Scripture that are not present. So I think it was the old preacher, he wrote, many wonderful things in the Bible we see, many of them put there by you and me. Truth has necessary logical consequences. That is, if or since one thing is definitely true, then other things must necessarily also be true. Or if or since one thing is true, then certain other things cannot also be true. If or since one thing is not true, then certain other things also cannot be true. So, an example, salvation. If salvation is received by grace through faith alone, then works, talking about things like baptism and church membership, works are excluded. This is because grace and works are mutually exclusive. So when it comes to salvation, grace and works, they are mutually exclusive. You can't mix them up. If you do, one cancels the other. Paul wrote of this in Romans chapter 11 and verse 6. And an example of impeccable logic occurs in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I'll be very brief with this. Some members of the Corinth church were being influenced to deny bodily resurrection. Paul argued, this is 1 Corinthians 15 verse 13. He argued, but if there is no resurrection from the dead, then Christ is not risen. You see the logic he used. He said, well, look, you can't have it both ways. If there is no resurrection, well, then Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Paul went on to show that if Christ is not risen, then Christianity collapses upon itself. But he goes on to say, but now Christ is risen, and since he is risen, then this is a guarantee of a bodily resurrection. Okay, so we're going to make some application here of scriptural principles and reason to the matter of those God calls to spiritual service. We reason that God does not call unregenerate, unsaved people to service. You say, well, Jeff, the Bible does not state this explicitly, and that is absolutely correct. Yet, were God to call unsaved people to commitment, to service commitment, this would violate some principles. It would violate God's character himself, and it would violate some scriptural principles. For example, an unregenerate person is incapable of obedience. Give you an example. Romans chapter 8, verse 7, Paul said, because the carnal mind is enmity against God. There is a condition of hostility. It is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. An unregenerate person, Paul stated in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, an unregenerate person is dead in trespasses and sins. We understand further that God does not make a truce with unsaved persons. He does not bypass their need to be saved and call them to spiritual service. So, what I'm saying here then, if one is not careful, he can introduce works into the freeness of salvation, complicate the beautiful simplicity of the way one receives salvation. He can rob believers of assurance of their salvation, and most importantly, diminish the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, because he ends up saying, well, what Jesus did on the cross didn't quite get the job done. There's something I need to contribute to complete my salvation. Which brings me to say, scriptural baptism and church membership play no role in receiving, completing, or keeping eternal salvation. One will never be any more or any less eternally saved than he is at the instant of faith into Jesus Christ. So, example, John 5:24, Jesus said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me has, present tense, everlasting life. Future tense, shall not come into condemnation. And past tense, perfect tense really, has passed, but has passed and will remain passed from death unto life. Belief, believe. Now, if this is not true, then one ends up smuggling works into eternal salvation. Scriptural baptism and membership in a scriptural church concern the salvation, if you will, of a child of God's temporal life. Works of obedience do play a role in the deliverance and the preservation of the spiritual value and ultimate outcome of a child of God's temporal life. This is what we speak of as salvation of the life. A child of God can save, deliver, preserve the spiritual value of his life, or he can lose it, he can destroy it, he can forfeit it by living selfishly and not serving the Lord with his life. So works do play a matter. Works do play a role in the deliverance and preservation of the salvation of a child of God's life. However, it is important that we understand motive or motives for service matter. Any works of obedience that are not motivated by love for the Lord are not acceptable to him. In fact, they're really not obedient works if they're not properly motivated. Let me give this example. Working to be in the bride of Christ disqualifies one from this highest of rewards in heaven. There are people who claim, well, we're the bride, we're the bride. I want to ask, well then, do you mean to tell me that you think you are worthy of the highest honor in heaven, the highest of rewards? This is church salvation. So, the teaching of church salvation, talk about this just a little bit. The teaching of church salvation is usually a product or a result of a frustrating church experience. So, Baptist churches, I know a little bit about Baptist churches. I have a Baptist background. Baptist churches that link baptism by a church that has the right word or words in its name, and they link salvation to dues paying church membership. In other words, they link baptism by the church that has the right kind of name, and additionally dues paying membership in that same church. they link these things to eternal salvation, these kind of churches typically are numerically small. Pastors and members are frustrated about those who are unfaithful or indifferent. And so what happens is church salvation becomes kind of a defense mechanism as well as a coercive tool. You come across the mentality that goes kind of like, we are the truly saved ones because our names are on the roll of a church that has the right name or names, words in the title, and we're truly saved. And the rest of them old people that, well, the indifference or unfaithfulness of others, different beliefs of others, that proves that they're not truly saved. The frustration and the angst become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We are suffering for Jesus while them others are laying out of church. We're not happy in our service, but by golly, we're going to suffer till Jesus comes. And does that not make you, or, people, why do people not understand? People in their right mind, they're not going to want to come in and eat rock sandwiches with you all. What rational person wants to be part of something like this? So here's what we come to. We serve Jesus because we love him. If we serve him and we never get anything in terms of rewards, just the fact that we get to spend eternity in heaven with him, man, we are way overpaid. God does not call unregenerate people to receive scriptural baptism and to join with a church. He doesn't do that. Faithful members of a scriptural church who serve the Lord, not to be in the bride, but simply because they love him, could never repay him for his gift of salvation. Faithful church members, properly motivated, are no more spiritually saved than others outside a scriptural church, whether those others are religious or not. So what I'm saying then in closing, we must keep grace, free grace, the only kind. We must keep grace and works separate. I'll conclude with reading Romans chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. Now, to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him. Here's the simplicity of salvation. Believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly. His faith is counted for righteousness. So again, not everything the Bible teaches us is explicitly stated, explicitly spelled out, but the Bible teaches in principles and concepts that are never violated, and we take the truths that we do have, and by logical deduction, we understand other things either to be true or not be true. So thank you for joining me. God bless you, and take care.